Well, I'm glad, Terry, that you finished your talk by bringing a photograph of one of your former teachers to bear. I felt that I had to make a reference in passing to one of my former teachers who introduced me to Khalil Gibran. Is that better?
Yeah, I could raise it a little bit.
Okay, right. And that is Sohail Bedi Boushroui, who was, of course, a former occupant of the chair which now Professor Rihani so illustriously upholds. And it was Professor Boushroui who introduced me to the writings of Khalil Gibran and to Amin Rihani. And I would also like to say thank you very much to Professor Salam, really, for providing an arching overview of what I am going to attempt to discourse on in terms of contemporary scholars' views of Amin Rihani in particular and Khalil Gibran. I have to say that I am not an Arabist. I am unfortunately one of those, to use a word which academics use, which they've taken from German, Ersatz, which means a sort of a pale kind of reflection, if you like. Somebody who has been, who has drunk at the well of that dubious scholar for many, for Edward Said, for some of us a great hero, but that unfortunately is the fact of the matter. So you'll have to give me due consideration. And thank you also back to Professor Rihani for overlooking my paper initially and weeding out some of those, giving me the opportunity to weed out some of those rather referential remarks which post-colonial scholars tend to make. So in attempting to sketch an overview of recent critical reception of the two writers, my emphasis will be primarily on Rihani and Gibran's relevance to the 21st century. So that is where I think my paper sort of ends up in some ways where Professor Salam began. First, I shall pose the question as to whether distinctions need to be made between the contributions each brought to the Mahjar movement, as studied in the context of Arabic letters and the larger Arab literary and intellectual renaissance, al-Nahda, and to Arab Anglophone migrant literature. So I'm going to be talking about two approaches which are now quite current in scholarship towards those writers, which is on the one hand through al-Nahda and the Mahjar movement, and the other is through Arab American literature. The diverse critical approaches of specialists in the two fields will therefore come into play. My task is to calibrate Rihani and Gibran's impact on the worlds of modernity, beginning with the international stage of the early 1900s and the struggles on behalf of Arab nationalism and modernity of the interwar period, before moving to the discussion of their place in post-colonial and conceptions of revised world literature in the way that they look at those writers. So the up-and-coming, now well-known Egyptian-American critic Wael Hassan describes the Book of Khalid as this inaugural text of the Arab American fiction and of Anglophone, the Anglophone Arab novel. And that's how he describes the Book of Khalid. And then points out in his book Immigrant Narratives of 2011 that the Book of Khalid remains relatively unknown. Well, that, of course, was before Todd Fine set the project into process whereby the Book of Khalid was republished quite recently, and a number of scholars made contributions to situating the Book of Khalid in contemporary terms. For a French-based Lebanese academic, Leila Dakhli, Rihani was, quote, an English speaker at the beginning who traveled back from the United States to his homeland to relearn his language and remained a Mahjar writer, listened to and read and invited to contribute to magazine and newspapers across the Arab world. So these two assessments, one newly minted in the mold of Arab American literature, and viewed through the prisms of migrant writing and Orientalism, and the other we might call a neo-Nahda reading of Rihani as significant as an Arab intellectual, might nevertheless be considered to be to represent variant perspectives of the same phenomenon. Those whose work focuses on Gibran and Rihani as Arab literary figures and intellectuals working within the far-flung cosmopolitan Nahda tend to stress, as Leila Dakhli does, their links to the Middle East. This is also the case with Ilham Khoury Makdisi, writing alongside Dakhli in The Making of the Arab Intellectual, who quotes from a speech Rihani made in America in 1900, valorizing socialism. So he's looking at the influence of Rihani as a Nahda intellectual for the Middle East, but situated within the American context. In contrast, Wael Hassan's immigrant narratives can be said to have built on the discipline of Arab-American literary studies pioneered by Evelyn Shakir, bringing, among other things, a long overdue theoretical sophistication to study of Rihani and Gibran's writings by invoking Edward Said and Deleuze and Guattari's framings of Orientalism and minor literature, respectively. According to Hassan, the two Lebanese Americans are united, quote, in their rejection of the classical Arabic heritage, due to their formal Arabic education, but also to Orientalist denigration of Arab language and literature in general. Groundbreaking though his book, Immigrant Narratives, undoubtedly has been, some have felt that Hassan places a lot of emphasis on Orientalism that clearly impacted on Rihani's Anglophone writing pre the Great War. However, rather unsurprisingly, given the American focus, the study diminishes Rihani's mature work of the 20s and 30s and the Arab and international dimensions connected with it. A third way of assessing Rihani has been to take an approach which frames him according to broader political or cultural formations of the modern age. In her study, The Politics and Poetics of Amin Rihani, subtitled The Humanist Ideology of the Arab-American Intellectual and Activist, Naimy Mahjar has written of the subject's, quote, progressive secular humanist vision and abiding interest in engaging both the Arab world and the West, categorizing him as, quote, one of the very few bilingual Arab humanists who have distinguished themselves as both American, in both the Arab and American worlds. Ralph Khoury's inclusion of Rihani in a recent anthology locates him among Arab thinkers who propound advanced ideas and battled against traditionalism. Khoury epitomizes a revived interest in Rihani when he writes of his contribution to, quote, an uncommon cosmopolitanism, a stance both endorsed and, sorry, I have to take this out of this covering. A stance both endorsed and creatively explored by Christoph Schumann in a brilliant and innovative chapter on Rihani in Liberal Thought in the Eastern Mediterranean. In his posthumously published contribution to Todd Fine's critical edition of the Book of Khalil, Schumann identifies Rihani as a public intellectual rather than an ideological one. Notes his application of bridging labels, we've been talking about that already, and suggests that it is incorrect to reduce him to, quote, an Arab, Syrian, or Lebanese intellectual. Interesting point of view, which some might disagree with. Concerning modernity, Naimy Mahjar interestingly points out that Rihani was optimistic about its potentials, wishing to ally the Arab world with the West, in particular promoting America's economic involvement in Arab lands. Whether or not that optimism was sustained through his later post-war anti-colonial agitations against France and Great Britain, it is certainly the case that the world in which he grew up started to make a name for himself suffered an immense impact with the outbreak of the First World War. So that is one of those critical points which Professor Salam was talking about when the world changed, we might say, and when the wider optimism of the Nahdar and of the mystical sources which Gibran and Rihani were attached to, when those positive vibes, to use sort of a current term, were very much challenged. And obviously one has to observe that the belief in the East-West unity and brotherhood, which was current in the advanced circles of the pre-Great War epoch, decisively contrasts with the development of later Arab immigrants, both Christian and Muslim, who experienced the traumas of the Nakba of 1948 and the Nafsa of 1967. So at the outbreak of the Great War in 1914, internationalism was dealt a fateful blow. And this impacted on Rihani and Gibrani with respect to the esoteric circles they were connected to at the time. A recent study of the welcome liberal Christians in Britain in the early 1900s gave to Eastern savants ends with a sudden and complete disintegration of that project in 1914. Of course, these savants, people like Vivekananda, Abdul Baha Abbas, who came to the West, including America as well, were sort of on the crest of the wave of that project. Wouter Hanegraaft has argued that, quote, the phenomenon of the New Age religion in which Rihani and Gibrani may be said to have invested was, quote, born in the 19th century and reached maturity not later than the beginning of the 20th century. But he postulates that, quote, intellectually, nothing really innovative has been added since. In Britain, clerics who had expressed remarkably unsectarian interfaith aspirations abandoned them and threw their energies into supporting the war effort. Correspondingly, during the war, Rihani traveled to Mexico to enlist the Arab diaspora there in the cause of the Allies, and Gibran did much on behalf of his compatriots in Lebanon. So they were each involved in the war effort in that breakup of the internationalist trend, if you like, which was before the war. After the war, still living in Boston, Gibran was, we might say, insulated from the partisan struggles that wrecked the internationalism of pre-1914. But he continued on his visionary path that would eventuate in the publication of The Prophet in 1923. Rihani, however, perhaps somewhat ironically, engaged even more with the world after 1918 than he had done before. And it was at that period that his transcendentalist and purely literary concerns dropped off as he turned to journalism and travelogue writing. And it is here that both Mahjar and Nahdar oriented an Arab-American literary critical approaches to Rihani tend to tail off. This is something actually which, while Hassan, I think, probably found at odds with my book on Rihani, which was that my book, which I published in 1998, is largely concerned with Rihani's post-1918 work, particularly with respect to his travel writing and to his engagement with figures like Ibn Saud of Arabia. So that figure that Rihani constitutes in the 1920s and 30s tends to be neglected by both the approach that looks at Rihani as a Mahjar writer and as part of the Nahdar, and also by Arab-American contemporary approaches. So we have to, I think, bring in the question of how we view those interwar years and what has happened since. And that is where postcolonialism comes in. And of course, that is where the very important intervention of Orientalism in 1978 comes in, when that experience of Arab Americans, which is a different experience for the Mahjar, coming up to the Great War, that experience of Arab Americans intersects with the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and the way that Arab intellectuals perceived that America was taking one side against the other. and in fact their very identity as Arabs was kind of revisited and recalibrated. So I'm going to just say a little bit about the way Arab-American writing might categorize Rihani. Carol Fadar, for example, who's a contemporary scholar of migrant Arab writing, points out that the Book of Khalid's multi-locational setting disrupts the unidirectional emphasis of the typical migrant narrative and replicates Rihani's own transcultural perspective. So she's using words like transcultural, and she's talking about his multi-directional perspective. However, she then brings in the post-colonial view, derived from the insights of Said's huge contribution to post-colonial theory, and confirms Wael Hassan's position that the novel, quote, remains mired in Orientalist logics of East and West, despite Rihani's attempts to mediate between the two. So this is the crux of contemporary understanding, I think, to some extent, of Amin Rihani and much more of Khalil Gibran. That is the way you look at the East-West binary, which is positive, you might argue, in the way that it is discussed in the Book of Khalid, but becomes severely problematic when it comes to the Nafsar of 1967 and thereafter. And the whole issue of colonialism comes into play when we look at the way the humanities is viewed across the board. So I will just move on then to talk about several other more recent views of Rihani. I think, in fact, what I want to say now is that while categorization, according to literary and cultural theories, is of course very important in facilitating a deeper understanding of Rihani and Gibrani's relation to their own epochs and today's world, it is at the same time important not to lose to allow our fascination with calibrating the positionalities of each figure according to the latest fashionable academic tools to detract from our sensitivity to their diachronic significance as well as to their continuing relevance. So here we're talking about a sort of coming back again, if you like, to a more conventional approach in looking at Gibran and Rihani. Now, I must admit, I'm not, although I was a student of Sohail Bouchouri, I'm not the greatest fan of Khalil Gibran's writings, and it might be because of that unfortunate ersatz character, if you like, of people who work in fields like Orientalism and post-colonial studies. But I would say that coming back to a writer from Al Jadid magazine recently, that it's probably necessary for us to look at Gibran's writings again, in the context partly of the way contemporary humanities thinking is looking again at the notion of modernity. And that notion of classical modernization theory is being replaced more by those who want to talk about a global sociology of modernity. And have moved beyond classical modernization theory, centered on the West, and have posited other modernities in which religious and other pre-modern traditions are assigned, quote, a general role in shaping different forms of modernity. So I think what I want to say here is that there is a space, if you recalibrate modernity from this Enlightenment project, from this project which advances Western technology and all those things which are associated with the Enlightenment, and you look towards other possible ways of looking at modernity, such as the Mahjar, such as Amin Rihani's writings, then that would prove, I think, a possible, in fact, if we've got any potential PhD students here and they'd like to take up that positioning, they can either come to me or to other people, and they might be able to find a way of passing on to that. So now I'm just going to end up with talking about a place where, of course, and I think that place is here in the room today, where Gibran and Rihani are still thought of, and Naimy as well, as prophets of New York, if you like. And that is within the tradition of Lebanese scholarship, which looks at Rihani and Gibran in obviously a much more favorable way than perhaps some of the critics that I've been looking at. And I want to end with a quotation which, as editor of our house journal, the Journal of Intercultural Inquiry, in that journal we ran an article by Noir Moulawi Diab entitled Interreligious Tolerance, Amin Rihani's Key to Religious Reform and Political Unity. I think Dr. Diab works at the Lebanese American University. So she says, talking about this period, so coming back to what Professor Salem was talking about at the very beginning, she says, religious intolerance among Christians and Muslims, and even atheists, abounds in the world, and sectarianism is also alive and well. What is ironic is that violent fanatic acts are almost daily being committed in the name of religion. If Rihani were to return to the earth today and witness all these atrocities, he would reiterate what he had said more than a century ago, but this time with reference to the 21st century. Do we really belong to this century, this century of civilization, enlightenment, democratic principles, and so on? So the beginning of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century, we're still wrestling with these issues. In fact, as concerns the erasure of religious prejudice and racial fanaticism, this epoch has nothing to boast of in advance of the world 100 years ago. Rihani and Gibran, therefore, remain abreast of our times.